Hi, my name is Bandy, and this is my channel, Bandy's Books. This is my buddy Gibson here to do a quick reading update with me. I don't know about you and where you're at, but here in Las Vegas, it's starting to feel like fall, finally. The weather's cooling down. We've been having some wind. We even got a little bit of snow in the mountains outside of Vegas, which is all super, super exciting. So I thought I'd celebrate with a nice mug of hot cocoa and some comfy flannel PJs, reading time, and cuddle time with my favorite dog on the couch to celebrate. In this video, we're just going to talk about what I've been reading for the last 3 weeks. I'm going to include some of the books that I read towards the end of September just because I wasn't posting YouTube videos before October. So I'm going to give you an update on all the books that I've been reading, everything that I finished. I'll give you a rating, a little plot summary, and a little bit of helpful info so maybe you can decide to pick up. Right. So the first couple books that I'm going to talk about are written by the same author, and I had heard that there's a bit of crossover between the two stories, so I decided to read them back to back in one weekend, so that way I could kind of see the crossovers. The stories are The Silent Patient and The Maidens, both by Alex Michaelides. I didn't really know too much about Alex Michaelides prior to reading these two books. I had never looked at his work before, never heard too much about him aside from people raving about him on Instagram. But I didn't really have any kind of concept for what his writing was like. I knew that he was like a fan of big plot twists, but even then, I didn't really kind of know much more than that. So going into The Silent Patient, I tried to go in with a pretty open mind. That book features Alicia. Alicia is an artist who's recently murdered her husband and been locked inside of a mental institution. Since the murder of her husband, she's been completely mute and refused to speak to anyone about anything. There's been psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists, etc., that have tried to talk to her, coax the story out of her, why she killed her husband, but she has remained completely quiet. That is until Theo, a new psychologist, shows up at the institution, and he seems to almost be like a fanboy of Alicia. He loves her artwork, he's followed the whole story, he's aware of the whole history of everything, and he decides that he's going to treat her. So the story kind of follows their treatment and the relationship that they build through therapy. And I can't really talk about it in too much more depth without, spoiling the story, but it is very twisty and it does get dark in some places. I will say that for me, the plot twist became pretty clear at about 3/4 mark. I had a pretty good inkling of where the story was going. So I wasn't exactly gobsmacked by the plot twist at the end. I did think it was creative and I did think it was interesting, but I feel like there was a lot of clues and a lot of red herrings in place that kind of led me to that conclusion before the book itself concluded. I think overall, I would probably give this book a 3, maybe a 3.5 out of 5. I really enjoyed it. It's a good book. I think the writing is, it flows very nicely. It's pretty seamless. I think the characters are deep and interesting. I do think that for me, the plot twist, it almost seemed like it was trying super hard to go against what you might naturally be inclined to think. So for me, I don't know if the plot twist worked all the way. I think that overall the story was really good and definitely worth reading. It is creepy and it's really good for that spooky Halloween vibe. So if you're looking for something that's kind of a psychological thriller to pick up this month, that's a good place to start. So I had read The Silent Patient on Kindle, and then I found a copy of The Maidens at my local bookshop, and I really liked the cover of it, so I went ahead and picked it up. At the time, like I said, I had not read any Alex Michaelides, so I didn't know what to expect from this. This story is about a character named Mariana. Mariana is a group therapist who specializes in trauma, and she is recently widowed. Her niece Zoe is a student at Cambridge, and one day Zoe reaches out to Mariana and says that she's really upset because her friend is missing. And it turns out that her friend has been murdered, and Mariana takes off to Cambridge to console Zoe like the good aunt that she is. Once she gets to Cambridge, she kind of gets dragged into an investigation of what's going on. And during that investigation, she comes to suspect Professor Fosca, who is the Greek tragedies professor at the university. this leads her down some really dark and interesting rabbit holes, and she has to deal with her own trauma as well as the things that are going along at the university. Um, I found this to be a pretty good book. With the same with the Silent Patient, I felt that Alex Michaelides is really good at building tension throughout the story. It is a really slow burn. It kind of both stories had a very leisurely pace in the beginning, and then they kind of intensify and intensify and intensify in creepiness all the way up until the climax. I had the same issue with the Maidens that I had with the Silent Patient, and that is that I had the plot twist figured out pretty well before the end. Particularly with this one, I think with the Silent Patient, it took me a little longer to figure it out. With the Maidens, I was pretty suspicious like a halfway through the book, and then about 2/3 in, I was pretty concretely sure that I knew where the book was going. I think for me, the reason that I was able to figure out the plots for both or the plot twists for both of these is because I think that Alex Michaelides is a bit heavy-handed with his like red herrings and his misdirects. I think that he's constantly pushing you while you're reading to feel that one person is responsible or that one thing happened. And it's almost always like the exact opposite. It's like a distraction or a sleight of hand that a magician would use. And I guess for me, it kind of left the plot twists feeling a little flat. I still think it was a good book. I think both books were good and definitely worth the read. I just think for me, it wasn't as mind blowing as I'd hoped they would be. I think for the Maidens, I would probably give it a 3 out of 5. So just slightly less than the Silent Patient. If you're gonna pick one or the other, I think I would definitely go with the Silent Patient. But I think the Maidens is worth a read too, and they're both relatively short. There is a little bit of crossover between the two books, so if you have the time and the inclination, I think reading both of them in tandem the way that I did is a good way to go. This is another one that is great for a Halloween list. The next book that I'm going to be talking about is a book that I got through the Libby app, which if you don't have, you should check out. That is like the best friend of any avid reader. And I just downloaded it into my phone and read it as an ebook. The Push is a story that is a psychological thriller kind of focused on motherhood. And for me, I was honestly super skeptical about reading this book in the first place. I'm not at all interested in children or motherhood. It's not a subject that I find myself wanting to read about. But after all the rave reviews of the story, I figured I'd give it a try. And I'm so glad that I did. This is probably one of the best books that I think I've read on this list, period. It is dark and creepy, very, very psychological, and it kind of focuses on motherhood, the struggles of a new mother, postpartum depression, and all the insecurities that can come with, raising children. So our main character, Blythe, has what seems to be the perfect husband, the perfect life. They're happy and in love. They decide that they're going to expand their family. So Blythe gets pregnant and gives birth to a daughter named Violet. And Blythe has kind of a troubling experience with her pregnancy and giving birth. She just feels like something's wrong the whole time. But this isn't entirely unusual for her because she comes from a family with a long line of dysfunctional women, and she's kind of afraid going into motherhood. So it's, kind of to be expected that she'd have some reservations or some concerns. Her husband Fox reassures her. Initially, they're doing the best they can, but the more the baby grows and the more she develops as a tiny human being, the more Blythe feels that things are amiss. She just doesn't feel the mother to daughter bond. And it leads her to some dark places. When she has a second child, she feels like things start to click into place and things start to feel more natural. Mm, Again, I don't want to give away, anything that happens from that point forward. I don't want to spoil the book because it's definitely worth going and reading. But it goes down some dark avenues, and you really find yourself questioning Blythe as a character, as a mother, as a narrator, as many different things in the story. And it is really interesting for me that it made me feel sympathetic for the character, but also made me question her at the same time. It made me wonder if, she was a reliable or unreliable narrator. I kept going back and forth. I kind of never really felt grounded in either decision. And it stayed that way all the way up until the conclusion. There's a plot twist at the end. And while I did think that the plot twist was possible, I wasn't sure that it was going to go in that direction. So, I mean, I had theories that it might end that way, but I wasn't for sure until it did end the way that it did. And it kept me on the edge of my seat. I read the whole book in like 2 days because I just couldn't get through it fast enough. I found the whole concept really interesting, and especially for someone that isn't really attached to like a family or a married life or having children or anything like that, I found that a remarkable feat that I liked it and related to the characters so much. I would definitely give this book like a 4.2 out of 5. I think it's the highest rated book on my list so far, and I would highly recommend it if you only read one spooky or scary book this season. This would be it. The Push by Ashley Audrain. The next book in the list that I'm going to talk about is the first book of a series. I'm really hesitant about getting involved in series because I have the unfortunate need to finish an entire chain of books to get to that conclusion. I can't just leave unfinished after book one or book two if I don't like it. In this case, though, I had read a lot of really positive feedback for the book and for the series and the author, and I was like, okay, I think this will be a safe series to start. After reading the first book, I'm honestly surprised that there's not more hype around this series. I personally love it, and I'm going to be recommending it to everybody if you're looking for a multi-book um, series to read. In this case, the book is The Bone Season by Samantha Shannon, and it features a character named Paige Mahoney. She is a rare type of clairvoyant called a dreamwalker, and the story is set in a modern dystopian version of London. It's pretty far in the future, and there's kind of a weird dystopian sort of a dictatorship that controls everything. People that are clairvoyant are considered to be a danger to society and are actually terminated when they're caught. So Paige has been forced into an underground crime syndicate run by Jackson Hall, who's an infamous crime boss basically in the area. After doing some work for the crime lord, she kind of gets caught up and gets sent off to what is essentially a prison camp for clairvoyants. And there she meets the warden who becomes responsible for her care. And kind of sets the story off into this fantastical world of multiple dimensions, alien creatures, clairvoyance, a whole bunch of different elements. It's really fascinating. Initially, it didn't really seem like the kind of book that I would like. I'm not super into sci-fi, so when I started seeing like aliens and things like that, I was like, I'm not so sure. But I kept getting told, no, give it a chance. And again, I'm really glad that I did. This is a really good book. It's super, super, super detailed. It's insane how much thought Samantha Shannon has put into the world that she's creating. She's created this whole hierarchy of clairvoyancy, all these different types of skills and sub skills, different worlds, different dimensions. It's just insanely complex, and it's not straight sci-fi. It's more like sci-fi and fantasy and dystopia and horror. It's like a mix of all of those genres together, and it takes like the best elements of each of those genres and creates this magical thing. I found each character to be really deep and interesting. The motivations were understandable for at least the good guys. And I couldn't stop reading it. I think I did the whole book in like 4 days. And I am currently waiting for the second book in the series at the library right now. I think if you're looking for, like I said, a multi-book series, this is a great place to go. Samantha Shannon is an awesome writer, and I imagine that the books are only going to get better from here, as this was the first book that she ever published, as far as I'm aware. I know that her other book, The Orange Tree Priory, is super popular right now. If you've read that and you like that, then maybe try giving the Bone Season series a try. The next book on our list is called The Monster in Olin Haven by Jennifer Geisbrecht. This book is what I would say is like a dark fantasy, dark horror, maybe even a little bit like graphic horror. And it is also the shortest book on the list. It's a novella. I think it was only like 150, 170 pages long. And it's definitely not my usual genre. I'm not really into like bloody graphic descriptions of murder and evisceration and things like that, which this book contains plenty of. So if you're squeamish, definitely probably not the book for you. The reason that I gave it a shot was because I saw the cover of it, and the cover was really beautiful. And I don't know, sometimes I'll look at a cover and just like, okay, I'm going to give it a chance. I like the way that this looks. So that was the case with this. I got it home. I read it in about 2 days. I could have finished it all in one if I had felt a little more connected with the story. I think I could have sat down and read the whole thing in one day. But because I felt it a little bit tiresome at times, I split it into 2 days for my sanity's sake. It follows a character who's nameless at the beginning of the story. He crawls out of a polluted, dark, dank, murky ocean onto the shores of a collapsing city. The city is Ellenhaven, and Ellenhaven is on its last legs. It's polluted, it's crumbling, it's been hit by a plague that wiped out a bunch of the population. And our unnamed character kind of crawls into town and decides to create havoc through violence. Eventually, he picks a name for himself and he names himself Johann. And Johann is on a crime spree. He's robbing and killing and doing all sorts of things within the city to cause chaos. He meets Florian. Florian is a wizard of sorts, and the two kind of create a dark scheme to mess with the people of Ellenhaven even more than they already are doing. It is, again, like I said, very brutal. It is really graphic in its depictions of violence. Um, it does not shy away from like nitty gritty details of things. Personally, I could have done with a little less of those details myself, but I also knew that going in. I know that that's not usually my favorite style of writing. So, what I can say about it is that I really appreciate the author's descriptive talents. She creates a very, very visual scene. Every scene is very visual and tangible, and you can really imagine it. You can almost like taste the tang of the blood as things are being described. Um, it's very like a visceral feeling. It is a very interesting plot. I really like the concept, and I actually really like the whole story. The motivations of the characters were fairly realistic. Um, I think, like I said, the largest disconnect for me is it's just not my usual style, and I can't fault the author for that. That has nothing to do with their talent, their skill as an author. That's just a personal preference for me. I think I would rate this book about a 3 out of 5 uh, for my personal preferences. I think if you're really into graphic horror, that it would definitely be a higher rating because I do think it is a really well done book in that genre. It's just not my preference for genres. So that being said, my preference 3 out of 5 for somebody that's more into this genre. Perhaps it would be a little bit higher. It is, from what I remember, a debut novel for this author, and I will say that for a debut novel or novella, it's a really stunning piece. I think she did an excellent job. So, if you're looking for something quick and spooky, definitely maybe check this out this Halloween. The next book on my list is My Sweet Girl by Amanda Jayasissa. This book features a character named Paloma, who is originally from Sri Lanka. It is told in dual timelines. So, in one timeline, Paloma is a child at a Sri Lankan orphanage where she's been left after her mom abandoned her. And we get to see her basically growing up with the children of the orphanage. It is very picturesque. It's kind of cool because we get to see into a little bit of Sri Lankan culture, learn a little bit about what being a child there would be like. And then the second timeline is for Paloma as an adult, and she's been adopted by a wealthy American family from San Francisco. Her parents are off on a trip to revisit Sri Lanka, and at this time they're not speaking to her because she hasn't really lived up to their expectations. They adopted her hoping that she was going to turn out to be you know a very successful hardworking child, and she really is just kind of lost at this point in her life. She feels like she's failed their expectations. She feels like her life is kind of you know going nowhere basically, and she's dealing with a lot of like microaggressions, feeling like she doesn't really fit into the community that she's living in. She's been cut off from her parents financially, so she's living in a small apartment. She's barely making ends meet, and she's scraping by subletting one of her rooms to a Indian gentleman named Arun. Arun finds out some dark secrets from Paloma's past, and he starts blackmailing her. And so at the start of the book in this timeline, Arun is blackmailing her, threatening to like reveal her secret to other people. But one night, Paloma comes home and finds Arun dead on the kitchen table. She, of course, calls the police, reports that he's been murdered. And when the police show up, his dead body is nowhere to be found. Everything's clean, the puddle of blood, everything that was there that indicated there was murder has been cleared up mysteriously. And this kind of sends Paloma down a spiral. She's like, the police don't believe me. They think I'm crazy. I know what I saw. And she starts investigating his murder. And that leads her back to eventually the orphanage where she grew up. These two timelines weave back and forth between each other. So you kind of take a step forward in present day and then a step forward in the past, and a step forward in present day, a step forward in the past. And you move through those two timelines simultaneously to get a complete picture of the story that's occurring eventually. This book did have several plot twists. It was windy and weavy. I did figure out like the main plot twist, but I did not figure out a lot of the smaller plot twists that revolved around it. And I think that was what I enjoyed about this so much. There was a lot of surprises in this for me. It was really creepy, psychological, and it was one of those things where the story is very intense from the beginning. There's a lot happening. There's a lot, to keep you interested. It doesn't feel slow and boring, but the suspense builds and builds and builds and builds. And by the time that you get to the end, you just feel like everything's happening so fast. I mean, this book I finished in 3 days over a weekend, and I couldn't put it down. Like the last 300 pages or so, I read all in one go. I just was so engrossed with how this story was going to finish. I really think also, as a side note, that this has some excellent representation of things that somebody who's immigrated from another country might experience. The main character talks a lot about feeling like she doesn't quite fit in. People, because she's Sri Lankan, people mistake her for Indian and Pakistani and things like that. She even talks about feeling like she's just like a generic brown face to the white people surrounding her. And she talks about a lot of the microaggressions that she has to deal with, and feeling like she doesn't quite fit into the white family that's adopted her. That they're well intentioned and they're kind people, but that ultimately she just doesn't feel like her they're her family. Um, and I found those things really interesting. They're help make the character deeper and make her experience a little more realistic. Even though the story that's unfolding can be a little bit fantastic at some points, I think that having those sorts of internal struggles really helps like make the character feel real and really ground the story in reality. This was probably, again, out of all these books, like definitely in my top three. I would probably rate this about a 4 out of a 5, and I would highly, highly recommend it if you are looking for a good spooky book for Halloween. The next book on my list is Billy Summers by Stephen King. This is his newest book that just came out. I haven't read a whole ton of Stephen King's books. I've read a couple, and all of them were very, very strictly in the horror genre. This is a bit of a break from his traditional horror, spooky vibe. It is psychological thriller, suspense, that kind of stuff. It follows Billy Summers, who is an ex-Marine. He was very decorated for his services in Iraq, specifically in Fallujah, where he worked as a sniper. He comes home, he's a little bit jaded, disenchanted with the world, and he ends up working for the mob as a hitman. He gets taken on to do one final job, and he just has to assassinate this one person who's a convicted murderer, and he's going to make a bunch of money and retire peacefully and never have to kill again. Of course, as we all know, things don't go that way. It's never that simple. And what ensues is a heart pounding, action packed suspense thriller sort of a story. Um, I really enjoyed this. I found some of it a bit cliche, I guess, in the sense that, he's got the whole Marine sniper backstory, turned mob assassin. His moral compass is kind of interesting, but kind of in line with like Dexter. I found him to reuse a handful of tropes, but I think that he incorporated enough new stuff into it to keep it interesting and fresh. Billy is soft spoken, he's thoughtful, really smart, really into books, logical, very clever, and he plays like a dumb person because he wants people to underestimate him. He wants people to, think he's not capable of much. And it's really interesting watching his story basically unwind. I will say one of my biggest criticisms of this book is that I feel like some of the female characters, it's very clear that they were written by a male author. I found certain reactions to certain things that happened by some of the female characters to be not realistic, or to be the way that I think a man would imagine those things happening, I guess. It wasn't like major and it didn't ruin the story for me. I think that those characters are still good characters and they definitely develop into really interesting parts of the story. But I do think that there was points where I read this and went like, I don't feel like this is a realistic reaction or response here. It does touch on some difficult topics. Obviously, he's an assassin, so there's murder, some violence, there is some sexual assault, pedophilia is mentioned, things like that. So they don't delve into those things in like really super graphic detail, but there is some definite descriptions of those subjects. If you're prone to, being triggered by any of those things, then it might be a good skip. But if you like a good crime novel, if you're into like the mob boss assassin kind of dynamic, I think this is a good one. I've heard this compared to one of Stephen King's previous novels, something 1963. I forget what the novel is specifically. Brain fart. Anyways, I haven't read that novel, so I can't particularly compare it, but I have heard comparisons of this being similar to that. I think overall it was a pretty good read. I would give it like a 3.5 to a 3.75 out of 5. I think, like I said, if there was some tweaking on the female characters, maybe a little less cliche, reliance on cliches and things, I think it could be like a much better book. But I think overall it was good. It's worth the read. I will say it's really long. It's definitely the longest book on this list, and it was a hefty read. It is a little slow in the beginning. So if you do pick it up, just bear with the first bit. It is a lot of setup, but all that setup is going to pay off when you get to the second half of the book. It makes sense. You'll understand why it kind of meanders along initially. So yeah, like I said, about a 3.75 out of 5. With a few tweaks, it could easily be a 4 out of 5 for me. Up next is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. This book has been all over the place. It's on Book Talk, it's on Bookstagram, it's on BookTube. Every book list that I've seen, everybody's recommending it. It seems like everybody is raving about it. And I wish that I loved it as much as everybody else, but for me, this book was more of a miss than a love. It features a character named Addie who is growing up in a small French town, and her family is forcing her to get married. In desperation to not have to get married, she runs into the forest, drops to her knees, and starts praying to every god that she knows. And one god answers. She makes a deal with him. She's gonna be immortal and free, and the only thing that he asks in return is that when she's done with her life, he's able to take her soul. She doesn't realize that this is going to come with some like extra conditions at the time of making the deal. She just is desperate to get out of this marriage. Eventually, she realizes that part of this deal means that everybody is going to forget about her. So, like, while you're talking to her, you'll remember her, but as soon as you look away from her, as soon as she's out of your line of sight, you immediately forget her. So she wanders the earth for years and years and years, being forgotten by everybody. Her family doesn't remember her, her friends don't remember her, everybody treats her as a complete stranger. She's left destitute and scrounging for ways to make ends meet and survive. And she comes to realize that this character that she's made her deal with is essentially the devil, or as he's called in the story, the darkness. He does take a human form when he visits her, so she names him Luke. And after about 300 years of this life where she's just unrecognizable to everyone and she kind of just exists, she meets a man named Henry, and Henry is the first person that can actually remember her. And Henry and Addie bond, and that relationship kind of sparks something in Addie, and the story kind of takes some interesting turns from there. I like aspects of this story. I really like the concept of making this deal with the devil and being forgotten by everybody. I thought that some of the backstory was super interesting. My main problem with the story is it just was too long for me. It dragged on and on and on. Addie is 300 years old in the book, like in present day, and it felt like the book took 300 years to get to the present day. I wanted to love it. Like I said, I love the concept. I think B.E. Schwab's a good writer. I think the cover of the book is gorgeous. I think, like I said, the whole plot, like the outline of the plot sounds really intriguing. It just was so long. I feel like it could have been half the length that it is, and it would have been just as effective and just as good, if not better, because you wouldn't have to like teeter through 300 years of history to get to a very simple point in time. I will say that I really enjoyed Addie's relationship with the darkness or the devil, even though it's very icky. Like there's that Stockholm syndrome, like you're my captive kind of vibe, which I normally hate in any kind of like a romantic context, but they don't really have a romance going on. So this kind of like I resent you for keeping me captive vibe that they have, I enjoyed that. I also enjoyed Addie's stubbornness and unwillingness to submit. Even when she's miserable, even when life seems hopeless, she refuses to let the devil or the darkness get to her. Um, so that unquenchable spirit is something that I really enjoyed. I do also kind of feel like she's, I don't know, maybe slightly Mary Sue-ish. Like they spend all this time showing all this history that she goes through, but they never really show us like her learning any skills or teaching herself anything. But we're supposed to just take it that she speaks like 27 languages and she's an artist and she's this and she's that and she knows how to survive. And, she just is like almost too perfect throughout the story for me. And I guess I just wished, like, at points that she was like maybe slightly more human in some ways. I think she does start to become more human to me towards the end. Her motivations start to make a little more sense, but I definitely felt a lack of empathy for her at points throughout the story. Um, Unfortunately, I have to rate this book between a 2.5 to a 3 out of 5. I think if it was shorter and a little more concise, it would be like a solid 3.5 for me. But because it drags on so much, I think I can't rate it any higher than a 3. Of course, if you love it, that's totally okay. This is my own personal opinion. It's no hate on anybody that loved this book. Like I said, I think it's a cool concept and I do get why people are really excited about it. It just personally wasn't for me. Up next is a book by Lisa Jewell. I've been seeing Lisa Jewell popping up everywhere. It seems like she is the queen of suspense and psychological thriller. After reading this particular book, I understand why. That book was Then She Was Gone and features a character named Laurel who has lost her daughter Ellie. She's like in the story 10 years down the road, and Ellie disappeared at some point and just kind of vanished. And police thought she was a runaway, so they didn't really investigate. But Laurel feels deep in her bones that Ellie is dead. She just has that mother's intuition that her daughter wouldn't have run away and not contacted them at some point, that she was likely killed. So it's been 10 years. Her marriage has collapsed. Her relationship with her other two children are very tense. Generally, her life is like not in a happy place. It's not where she wants it to be. And she's just kind of existing, pushing through day to day. And she meets this guy named Floyd at a little diner and they hit it off. There's like an attraction immediately. And eventually, she ends up meeting Floyd's daughter, Poppy. And Poppy is eerily similar to her own daughter, her own missing daughter, Ellie, both in the way that she looks and the way that she acts. There's just lots of mannerisms and things that she does that remind Laurel of her missing child. And it's not just Laurel, it's the whole family, because eventually Poppy meets Laurel's ex-husband and her other two children. And they all remark that Poppy is just eerily similar to Ellie. And this kind of starts you down this path of what really happened to Ellie. And eventually Laurel starts trying to find the answers to questions that have been eating at her soul for a really long time. This plot twist, oh my goodness. Let me just say, pretty much every other book on this list, I had at least partially figured out the plot twist. I had figured out who did what, or I'd figured out how something was done, so it felt a little anticlimactic. This particular plot twist, I was so far off. I kind of had an idea of who was involved in the murder, which even that I was second guessing, but how things happened, how everything occurred, I would have never ever guessed. And honestly, I was kind of shocked and horrified when I found out the conclusion of the story. I will say that this definitely should have some heavy trigger warnings for violence, sexual assault, kidnapping, things like that. If anything like that is a sensitive subject for you, this is probably a skip. If you're okay with sensitive topics like that, then and you like suspense and psychological thrillers, then I highly recommend giving this one a go. I would rate this a 4 out of 5. I think that it does a great job of building the suspense slowly. Initially, you have like a very peaceful, happy vibe as Laurel and Floyd start their relationship. Everything seems really good and perfect. And then slowly it almost becomes like that Stepford Wives sort of a vibe where you feel like, oh, it's too perfect. Everything's too right. Something's got to be wrong here. Like, what's the catch? And then you find out the catch and you're just like, so again, if you want something suspenseful, you want a good plot twist, highly recommend this one. Okay, so we've gone over everything that I've read so far this month, and I just thought I would end really quick by updating you on what I'm currently reading. I have a couple things going. I'm one of those people that's like a little ADHD, so I like to have multiple books going all at once. That way, I can kind of like if I'm bored with one thing or I need to switch it up, I have a couple things that I can pick up. So I have 2 books that I'm reading at the moment. The first book is Sorrowland by River Solomon. I picked this up initially because of this beautiful cover. I was walking past the horror display at my local bookstore and saw it and was just like, oh, this is so mystical looking. I had no idea who the author was, no idea what the story was about. I just picked it up strictly because of the cover. Upon starting it, I'm not finished with it yet. As you can see, I'm just really starting it. Upon reading about it and reading about the author, I actually became even more interested in it. This follows a character named Vern who is raised in a cult called the Brothers of Cain. It is a specifically African American cult, and she ends up escaping. She's 15, and she ends up escaping the cult and fleeing into the forest. She's heavily pregnant during her escape, and shortly afterwards, she gives birth to twins, which she names Howling and Feral. There is a character named the Fiend who is chasing her through the forest and leaving dead animals as signs that he's hunting her. And she starts going through these weird physical and mental changes that are very unexplainable to her. And due to these changes, she starts to kind of delve into the history of the land that she's on and the history of the cult that she came from. And this leads her into the very dark history of African American people in the United States. It does cover medical experimentation, slavery, brutality, segregation, and themes of racism. So if those are troubling topics for you, definitely avoid this book. But I will say that so far they're really, really well done. This also has some excellent representation in that a couple of the characters, including the main character, deals with albinism. And it talks about some of the challenges of being albino and growing up albino. It also has some really good LGBT relationships, and it actually goes into those relationships in detail. It's not like just kind of sprinkled in just for the point of having a relationship there. It's like actually explored and portrayed. I have found the writing of this really engaging so far. I'm not super far into the book, but I'm really wanting to get much farther into it, having a hard time putting it down. I find the main character, Vern, really resourceful, really interesting. And as I'm learning more of her backstory, I'm really, really fascinated. I can't wait to get further in and kind of see what's going on here. The next book that I'm reading is called El Juego del Ángel, and it's by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. That translates in English to The Angel's Game. And it is the prequel to the Cemetery of the Forgotten Books series. The book that's most well known, I guess, in that series is The Shadow of the Wind. It was super popular a couple years back. It's an excellent book if you haven't read it. I'm taking a bit longer on this book. I've been reading for a while now for multiple reasons. One, it is written in Spanish. There's an English translation available, and I have actually read The Shadow of the Wind in English. But generally speaking, if I speak a language that a book is written in, I'll try my best to read it in that language instead of reading translations. So I am reading this in Spanish. Spanish is my secondary language. And though I'm fairly fluent, it is still, occasionally challenging. There's vocabulary that I run into that I'm unfamiliar with. And then I'm also reading this book with my partner, and my partner reads at a little bit slower pace than I do. So we've been reading this like kind of in a leisurely pace. Every night we'll read a couple chapters together, and we're just enjoying the story as it unfolds. This book is about a character named David Martin who wants to be an author. And as the story sets out, he is in a place where he hasn't yet become a successful author. He's mostly making his way by writing stories for money under as a ghostwriter, basically. And he's not really fulfilled. And he has, some unrequited love, a whole bunch of different little plot lines. But the main plot line is that he meets this mysterious publisher named Andreas Corelli, and Corelli promises him the entire world, basically, if he'll just write him a book about religion. And that kind of sets the tone for the story from there. It is a really dark psychological thriller. I find myself questioning whether the main character is a reliable or unreliable narrator, what's really happening, basically. And it's been very engaging. It has lots of humorous points. There's lots of like sarcasm and dry humor throughout this. It is like there's parts that are touching and heartwarming. There's parts that are brutal and dark. It's got a whole mix of a lot of different things. And it's set in Barcelona, which is cool. I've been to Barcelona, so it's kind of nice to like revisit it through the pages of the story. If you do not read in Spanish, the book is good in English as well. My mom is reading the series in English, so I've had a chance to look at all of the different books in this series in English. And the translation from Spanish to English that they've done for this book is one of the best that I've seen. It keeps the original essence of the book intact. She really does a good job of translating the author's like dry humor and a lot of like the colloquialisms and things that occur throughout this book. So if you're going to read this in English, don't feel like you're missing out. It's still an excellent, excellent book series in English. But if you do read in Spanish, I highly recommend reading it in the original Spanish. I'm really enjoying it. And if, like me, you're a second language learner and you're looking for something to practice your Spanish, I would recommend this to anyone that's like at an intermediate to advanced level. If you're below an intermediate level, you may be able to understand it, but you're going to be doing a lot of like pulling out the dictionary and like looking up words and that kind of stuff. For me, at this point, I'm able to read most of it and understand most of it without having to do too much, looking up words. I can usually figure out stuff by context. Occasionally, I do have to stop and read, Google words. But my partner, who is a fluent Spanish speaker, also occasionally has to Google words from here, just because different country, different slang, different colloquialisms and things. But it is really engaging, a really interesting book. I should be finished with it by the end of the month. And definitely a worthwhile series. I would give this so far probably a 4 out of 5. And for Sorrowland, the other book that I was reading so far, I would also give this one a 4 out of 5. Obviously, I'm still got quite a ways to go with both of them, so who knows what the rating will be when they're completed. But for now, I'm really enjoying both. That is the end of today's video. We have talked about lots of books. Hopefully you've gotten some good ideas of things that you might be wanting to add to your TBR, some things that might be good for, the weeks leading up to Halloween and that spooky season. Again, I'm Caitlin Bandy. This is my buddy Gibson. This is Bandy's Books. I hope you've enjoyed this fall evening book review of all the things that I've been reading in October so far. Thank you so much for joining me. And if you have a moment, drop a comment below. Let me know which books have interested you. And if you've read any of them, I'd love to hear what your opinions were. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Especially like on the controversies like Addie LaRue, let me know how you feel about it. Don't be shy. And if you like this video, give me a thumbs up. I really appreciate any feedback. And if you want more book related content, I publish twice a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays every single week. I post a book related recipe and I post a video like this where I talk about books that I'm reading, or I do book hauls or festive book themed events, things like that. So if you like those things, hit the subscribe button. I'm like clockwork every Tuesday and Thursday, very reliable about that kind of stuff. And hit the notification bell so you never miss a video. So again, thank you very much. This is Bandy's Books, and we'll see you in the next video.